This Passover, we're noticing that folks are quick to identify with the Israelites. But what about the circumstances where we're in the role of the Egyptians? How can we work to dismantle the binary of good and bad, victim and villain, and move toward greater wholeness?
This is Jews Talk Racial Justice with April and Tracy,
a weekly show hosted by April Baskin and Tracy Guy Decker.
In a complex world, change takes courage.
Wholehearted relationships can keep us accountable.
Passover is coming. Passover is almost here. Probably, Tracy, people are going to be tuning in as they are getting ready for Passover, and also during Passover, and also potentially after Passover. But so I think the bulk of people will be listening in the lead up to, the very quick lead up to, in the hours before and or while the holiday is underway. Woohoo! Yay! Passover is here. I love this holiday so much. And I think there's a number of different interesting themes that you and I are interested in exploring today. And I'm noticing right now that I'm having a desire to really dig deep. That there's some of the obvious places to go, and those are worthwhile and very fruitful. And I'm wanting to mine more deeply and notice parts of the holiday and the practice that are more taken for granted or more rhythmic, or just kind of go unquestioned. Like, they're the things that continue to evolve over time, like what's on the Seder plate and how we look at certain passages. But then there's broader parts about how we observe the holiday more generally, which we covered in our last episode. And today, I think there's a couple different places we could go. One theme that I think really stood out above the others is around the story we tell, in specific ways around how we retell the story and how we connect or don't connect with different actors in the Passover story.
Yeah. Exactly. I mean, the Seder itself invites us to imagine ourselves as the Israelites, leaving enslavement behind as the seas crash down. And I'm really holding the fact that regardless of our contemporary circumstances, or contemporaneous, if we're looking back historically at people having seders, like that identification stays the same. But in life, like, sometimes we are Israelites and sometimes we're Egyptians, and often we can be both at the same time, depending on, which relationship we're talking about. And I'm just I'm sort of holding the fact that, like, this, even if there weren't the explicit invitation, I think because the Israelites are the group with a relationship to God in the story, a positive relationship with God in the story, folks would identify that way and have identified that way throughout history, regardless of the other. So even when in complete power, different groups have identified. Different groups have self-identified with the Israelites historically, and it's just it is becoming a real question, a live question for me, to look again and say, well, but where am I actually Egyptian? And what is the divine intervention that is required for me when I am an Egyptian, ancient Egyptian in the story? I'm not denigrating people from Egypt. But when I am sort of in that, behaving as if I'm from Mitzrayim, what is the intervention that can help me, open my heart? Or I think the phrase in English is something like, God disposed the Egyptians favorably to the Israelites in order to allow the gold and silver to go out with them. What is that intervention? What does that look like? And do I have any agency in it? I don't know. These are live questions I don't have answers for.
And as per usual, my mind is going all over the place and I'm thinking about so many different things, right? Like I'm thinking about both what I'm anticipating us talking about, and then I'm also thinking about the theoretical piece. Here's what's coming up as you were talking initially, and then you said a lot more, and part of this feels very emotional for me. I have a reaction. I have a visceral reaction when the wolf claims to be Goldilocks.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about an Egyptian claiming to be an Israelite, and I can think back to both my childhood and even like I literally have a degree in sociology with an emphasis in social inequality. Right. And so there's something about that is clearly a place where I can do more healing about, which doesn't mean my perspective is wrong, but just that there's wounds there. I've both experienced a lot of pain and suffering in my own life, and been witnessed to people going through even worse. And so I've noticed over the years, like I don't even like recently, I was over the summer, recently-ish, relatively, I was in a debate with my significant other's twin brother. And he mentioned at one point that he was treated, like at a certain point in America, he was treated like a slave.
Mm.
And it was a fascinating moment, basically, to kind of what you were talking about, where in relationship to his twin brother, I'm living in Senegal, but as an American, as a member of an imperial, of the world empire, the one of the, if not the greatest world power. So in my mind, so I was, as a descendant of enslaved people, I don't like in general, even when someone who grew up in Africa, and so I was holding in my mind multiple variables. Like, I am a guest here. Also, there's a language barrier. So I don't want to fully hold him accountable. But internally, my emotional thermometer went through the roof when he was talking about basically people demeaning him and insulting him and speaking very disrespectfully.
Mm-hmm.
And as someone who has relatedly and unrelatedly survived sexual assault, and my life has been a cakewalk compared to my enslaved ancestors, I am very it goes into a really deep level. And to be clear here, the other thing that I was holding as you were talking, that I don't necessarily, this is something where I want there to be more consciousness around it. And I also don't hold everyone to one set standard, because part of this, like if you haven't lived, like God willing, in some ways, this should be in certain ways, not like now, but in the future, some people will never know. But ideally, they will have humility to also be clear that that is a horrific, that is a horrifying, terrifying, profoundly dehumanizing experience, particularly in the context of American chattel slavery, which was one of the worst in terms of its depravity. So it's just, I could keep talking here. There's multiple threads, wheels coming, like threads that could, wooden pegs that could come out of the spoke for me. But I'm happy to just follow you, because I'm just naming, for me, it's something that does really matter. And I'm also aware, like, it's not that I bring this, so that's a specific thing for me. That's like when people liken, when an
Hardship.
hardship, and specifically when, and to me, the diminishment of it, actually.
Yeah.
So part of it is about a miss,
exactly.
but also part of it is that you clearly have no, and I don't even need you to fully know, but I would appreciate it if you had humility to know
Right.
that you don't, to have humility, because part of that is also, I think part of it, I'll squeeze and I want to hear it. Part of what it is that there's lots of things I could say, but what's coming up is like, that's also explicitly to me an oppressor move to erase, is the erasure, is the invisibility of the suffering. And I don't need people to know it. And I would prefer that most people aren't actually that intimate with what it's like to be brutalized in that way, but to liken your inconvenience to depravity, it brings up something old that likely is not even from my own, exclusively my lifetime. Please,
it's a
back to you,
parallel.
Tracy.
A parallel would be like when we hear folks who don't want to have to wear masks in public compare it to Nazi Germany. Like it's that there
Yeah.
is a diminishment and erasure of the depth of the horror in that kind of a comparison. And or even like just this past weekend I finally read Mouse, the complete volume, Spiegelman, which
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little embarrassed that I'm 46 and I just read it. But I
We can't
I
have
knew it
all
was
the
I knew it would
books.
be hard, and so I didn't.
Yeah.
But
Yep.
when it was banned recently, and my daughter who was 10 was asking about like why was it banned, and I was like, you know what, let's read it. And so she read it first, and then I read it anyway. There is a point near the end where Art, in the book, says something like, "We need to eat. I'm starving." And in the context of this book, where we have seen Vladek during, in his stories about living through the camps, literally starving almost to death. Like the Nazis gave them just enough food to keep them from dying of starvation, and sometimes not even that much. Um, it really stood out to me as that sort of that hyperbole, which is not said with any
And is Art
malintent.
young?
No, not really. In his 30s.
Oh, okay.
I think he's meant to be when that happens. Um,
Okay.
but it's an idiom. It's the way we speak with that sort of hyperbole to mean I'm really hungry. Um, but those are actually not the same. And I think that's sort of a similar thing, not identical, but it's a
Yeah, it's
similar
similar but
sort of
different.
it's a similar sort of thing where people use language as hyperbole, but in so doing, really disrespect those who lived through the actual horror by comparing, as you say, an inconvenience with the
A
experience
life-threatening or
of
deeply traumatizing. And I
yeah
mean, this is what's interesting. So I want to. So in that scenario, that feels different to me, right? So I'm glad you shared that, because it feels similar, just like you said, and also different in the sense that there is someone in that scenario who has lived. I haven't read Mouse either. um,
that actually makes me feel a little bit better, April.
oh, good.
That
I'm
it took
glad.
me so
Yeah.
long.
Yeah. So yeah, I haven't read it yet either, and I've read other works around these themes, as you have too, and so I don't know the full context here, but in my mind, potentially, Art knows what this other person went through, and so it's like a slight slip of tongue, or that, like, I envision that, like, I have certain beloveds who at times later apologize, or who don't, who say certain things, and that feels different to me than when a group of people where the task is to embody understanding that specific thing, and they're not really getting it, or they're misusing the language. And it's not, and to me, it's not that I need people to go to fully unpack the horrors. That's not, because then, like, it's not, they're not bringing in a therapist and having, or trained people in trauma healing and having a trauma healing session. So it's not like I'm looking for all of the trauma to be unearthed, but there's a way where it starts to feel like our people, through the way they're talking about it and being so detached from it, to me, to take some of what you were going to say that I want to, and you already did start to say, is starting to sound more like a narrative of an Egyptian than someone who actually has a memory or endeavors to truly remember what it is like to be enslaved, which is not simply a narrow place. Mitzrayim is a great word to encompass that, but it's a lot more than just narrowness. It's about your child being killed. It's about you not having sovereignty over your body. It's about things that are, which God willing, one day I will be fine in the hypothetical messianic, God willing, it's coming at some point. And we are part of bringing that amazing, idyllic, collective liberation reality, right? Like, if in fact there is liberation, I'm okay at that point if people aren't fully connected to it, but in a time when in our own cities, in the own towns we are living in, people either identically or similarly are navigating sex trafficking,
Mm-hmm.
are navigating things that are on the scale of enslavement. I want a way, and it's not, and often this happens that this, I feel like I've had this with other things on the show, and it's a longing I have. It's not a thing of judgment, because in general, I do think that most people are doing the best that they can with the understanding and knowledge they have. And to kind of give people some practical steps right now, because I'm getting intense here and I want to make it clear this is not meant to be a condemnation, but to say what I want is through the kind of reflection we're doing and the Haggadot passages we're selecting, that there are narratives and stories that speak to enslavement type dynamics that are happening to people today, and for us to take time to, with profound self-love and compassion for ourselves and everyone in the room, engage in a meaningful, at the right level, process at the right level of depth. So not too deep, but also not too shallow, somewhere in that nice little juicy middle of engaging in meaningful reflection and thinking about how there are people today who are working multiple, it's not, and it's still not the level of enslavement, but it's one of the closer forms, who are working around the clock and they cannot afford healthcare, they cannot afford care and housing for their family. There is sex trafficking. The amount of enslavement today is higher than it was in the 1800s, than at the peak of American chattel slavery. Globally, the rates of enslavement are incredibly high of people today. How do we, as members of a people who strive for righteousness and courage and honesty, how can we support courageous reflection, not only on Passover, but in general? And to me, Passover is not just, this is something that we can start to lean into. So it's something that I would invite people, as Tracy and I continue in our conversation, to, if you haven't already, to explore ways that you might incorporate this year, and perhaps more realistically, start to chew on this and think about this now for next year. Because to me, the Passover is a point where you can see a reflection of what work we are or are not, or are not willing to do in an encapsulation. But it's really about what we're doing throughout the year around how can we, as you were speaking earlier, as you helped to introduce the conversation, Tracy, consider the ways that we are in our lives are oppressed and the oppressor. And then more deeply, are there ways where we are explicitly, and oppressor in Egyptian is pretty close. And then to me, there's a gradation between oppressed and like extremely
Right.
oppressed,
Right.
in not having sovereignty over your choices, and being trapped in your life, which
Mm-hmm.
most people, if we're at a Seder, most likely that isn't most of us.
That
So we
isn't
may have
real.
had moments, but a number of us across genders, across having both oppressor and oppressed identities, have had moments where we have felt that. And so how can we leverage those moments to honor and tend to ourselves, and also be like, that is actually what we're talking about. I'm not talking about my boss annoying me. That is a form, that's a light. That's Mitzrayim light. That's Mitzrayim privileged, potentially, unless you are in a job where you are underpaid, undocumented, and which in that case, it might be much closer to Mitzrayim. As we are retelling the story, are there ways that we can really hold the both and, that we are both, that in our lives, nearly all of us embody very clearly elements of being oppressed and being the oppressor? Specifically, can we look at and practice the fact that, I mean, basically what I'm saying is that part of it is that for most of us who are participating in a Seder, we may still not be fully free, but we, like, that's what I hold. Like, I don't think of myself as enslaved. I'm aware as someone who is a descendant just a few generations ago of people who were literally enslaved. I am very aware that I am not enslaved, and I never pretend to be enslaved. I do think, as I've often shared before at times, right, that the sea never parted for us, and we are still in Mitzrayim. And there has not been reparations. There has not been a collective, governmentally or nationally endorsed process of tikkun and of tikkun and teshuva, of healing and repair, and engaging in the difficult but worthwhile and sacred work of what does teshuva look like, right? And so that's part of what I'm holding, and also taking time in my practice, which I would encourage us to do, especially for people who have significant identities that are oppressor identities. So for Jews who are labeled as white in society, who have conditional whiteness, for people who are raised and identify as cisgender men, for all of us, for not necessarily for all of us, because we may have people who listen from other countries, and that's part of the point, a part of the oppressor pattern of USer material. Many people listening are US citizens and are a part of a country, while we navigate our own dynamics, that internationally is a powerful oppressive force in a lot of contexts. And so I think, to me, part of that intervention, to your point, I feel like you asked the question and also you provided the answer before you asked the question. So I'm just bringing them together. For me, is through in a joyous justice manner, which means from a place of profound honoring and holding that each of us is B'Tselem Elohim, made in the image of the divine, that we are each sacred and inherently good, and holding and unquabbing both and of having a good and ready mindset that Tracy talked about in one of our lives in the preparation for the launch of Racial Justice Launchpad, of how can you hold that your goodness is unquestioning. And we are in a society and we are navigating dynamics in which we are Egyptians in our own in narratives we're navigating. And as Tracy said, also in other ways, we aren't necessarily the Israelites to that extent, but we are on that. To me, it's kind of like a continuum. And the Israelites, or American chattel slavery, is part of the anchor, or people who navigated the Shoah are at the worst, or at the low, or at the most intense extreme version of that, of profound dehumanization. And a number of us are in that, which none of us should be. Ideally, we would be in a happy middle space where we are neither oppressed nor oppressor. And to me, part of what helps us get there, part of that divine intervention, is remembering our divinity, holding our divinity, while also being willing to mindfully reflect about the ways that we are Egyptians. And what's interesting about that, which is an interesting place to go and a little weird, but I still want to do it, and also is starting to notice, which might help us, is if we did this long enough, instead of constantly vilifying, which to me in general, villains aren't so helpful. Like being in a victim villain dynamic, often what we need is a third space where we are people who are beautiful or beautifully imperfect, who have choices that we can make that can lead us to different outcomes. And we have good and bad qualities. And similarly, that we spend time thinking about this